Friends, today I will be covering the discussion on the physiology of pupillary reflexes. Here I have given you the pathway diagram which I will be discussing during the course of my lecture. I cover this topic with the following questions. 1. What are the pupillary reflexes? Number 2. What is the anatomical basis for the pupillary size? Number 3. What are the pathways involved in the pupillary reflexes? Number 4. What are the functions of these reflexes? Number 5. The applied aspect regarding the reflexes. Let us take number 1. What are the pupillary reflexes? The pupillary reflexes involve adjustment of the pupil size. The pupil size is a dynamic one and it changes with the light levels as well as the changes with the distance at which the object is placed or the distance from which the image is formed. For light and dark adaptation, you see there is a constriction of the pupil to a bright light and dilation of the pupil in the darkness. This is a light and a dark adaptation. This is again a one type of a pupillary reflex to adjust the amount of light entering into the retina or entering into the retina to provide the visual activity, they maximize the visual activity. Then comes the light reflex. The light reflex, when a light is shown on the eye, on one eye, the pupils of both eye constrict. The constriction of the pupil on the same side is known as a direct reflex, and the constriction on the opposite side, the contralateral side, is known as a consensual reflex. I will explain why the direct and consensual reflex. It is now sufficient to say that in the midbrain, the fibers from one side will reach to the opposite side in the pretectal nucleus and in the Edinger-Westphal nucleus. I will explain that. Then another type of reflex known as a accommodation reflex or near reflex. When the object is brought to your eye from either from away to the near the eyes, as the object approaches, what happens? The eyeballs converge. That is what we see. And if you closely observe, the pupils constrict. And if you observe it much more, there will be a change in the convexity of the lens. So this type of a response is known as accommodation reflex. I repeat again, when a person attempts to see the near objects, reflexly the pupils constrict, the eyeballs converge, and the lens bulges or increases the convexity. And the reverse happens when you attempt to see the distant objects. So this is known as accommodation reflex, and it involves a number of pathways, number of neural elements along with the visual pathway. Okay, let us move on to the next part. What is the anatomical basis of the pupillary size? Here I am making the pupillary muscles are arranged. In the pupil, the iris has two type of muscles. So one is the circular muscle, radial muscle. This is a radial muscle. These radial muscles, the radial muscles. You can see here radial muscles. And when they contract, so when these radial muscles contract, they will try to open up the window, that is the pupil. This is a dilation. And these will be supplied by the sympathetic nerve coming from the cervical ganglia. And when there is a sympathetic activation, these would be contracting and they will dilate. So this is called as the dilation of the pupil is known as a mydriasis. And here on this side, there are circular muscles in the iris. And these circular muscles are supplied by the third cranial nerve, parasympathetic division. As compared to the radial muscles, they are supplied by the sympathetic nerve. Now, the parasympathetic part of the third cranial nerve that will make it to contract. When these circular muscles contract, that will diminish the size of the pupil or a pupillary opening. So this is the basis for a constriction, and this is the basis for dilation of the pupil. So here is an example. In the bright light, you have this pupil size uh, is smaller. That is because of the constriction of the circular muscles. And in the dim light, the pupil size is larger, that is the dilated pupil, and this is because of the constriction of the radial muscles. Usually the parasympathetic component, that is the constrictor part, is more dominant than the sympathetic component. This is about the anatomy of the pupillary muscles. Now, moving further, light reflex. Light reflex, as I have mentioned, when a light is shown on one eye, there is a constriction of the pupil on the same side as well as opposite side. That means both the pupil they constrict. Now, what are the pathways? So now the light reflex pathway involves retina. The receptors are rods and cones. And carried by the optic nerve. This is the optic nerve, and goes to the optic chiasma. They reach the optic chiasma. You can see one half of the optic nerve is coming from this side, and the other half is coming from this side. So optic chiasma, there will be a decussation of the half of the fibers, and this one will be continuing as an optic tract. And from the optic tract, usually the visual pathway, they end up in the lateral geniculate body. This is the lateral geniculate body. They primarily reach to the lateral geniculate body. The collaterals, they will reach to the, even before going to the lateral geniculate body, some of the collaterals reach to the pretectal nucleus in the midbrain. This pretectal nucleus, that means a part of the collaterals, otherwise this would have gone to the lateral geniculate body, and from the lateral geniculate body, it is the optic radiation going to the occipital cortex. And it will come up to the pretectal. So that means the receptors are rods and cones in the retina. The fibers are in the second cranial nerve, optic nerve. This optic nerve has a path, optic nerve, optic chiasma, optic tract, and then they will reach the part of this thing, they will reach the pretectal area or pretectal nucleus in the midbrain. And here they will share, or they will give it to both sides, on both sides, because it relays here pretectal nucleus of the on one side, and the some of these things will be relayed into the other side. Now from the pretectal nucleus, again it will supply to both. These are Edinger-Westphal nucleus. This is the nucleus for a third cranial parasympathetic nucleus, Edinger-Westphal nucleus, third cranial nerve parasympathetic nucleus. So now this is supplying on both sides. That means the one here it is coming up. So that means there is a mixture, or that is a sharing of the information on both sides, bilateral sharing. Now I have this is intentionally taken to the other side to make it clear. So the efferents, this is the efferent starting from the pretectal nucleus. This becomes the center. The Edinger-Westphal nucleus becomes the center, and from here the output goes through the third cranial oculomotor nerve, parasympathetic division, and released into the ciliary ganglion. From the ciliary ganglion, it will supply to the constrictor pupillae, that is the constrictor muscles or the concentric muscles. So they will supply that constrictor pupillae and constricts the pupil. So that means I have just the light is shown here, and when a light is shown, it is carried through the optic nerve, and it is reaching to the pretectal nucleus in the midbrain. So of course the optic nerve carries information that will go for the visual, these things that is relayed in lateral geniculate body and released further, and we are not because the collaterals reach to the pretectal nucleus. From the pretectal nucleus it is released into on both sides, and the one of these pretectal nucleus that will be relayed in on either side of the Edinger-Westphal nucleus, that is the third cranial parasympathetic nucleus, and that would reach the relay into the ciliary ganglion and then to the constrictor pupillae. That is how, and brings about the constriction. So this side I have not, or it is not made intentionally, because the clarity of the pathway is missing. So this is afferent connection, this is efferent connection. So I have made it here: retina, optic nerve, optic chiasma, optic tract, pretectal nucleus, Edinger-Westphal nucleus both side, the pretectal nucleus both side, the ciliary nerve, and ciliary ganglion, and this is ciliary nerve. The constrictor pupillae here, and a constriction of the pupil. Okay, here please note that it is only one side I want to show the afferent connection, one side I want to show the efferent connection, and this forms the center of the reflex. You should be able to answer this clearly. The next, what are the functions of the light reflex? So light reflex protect the retina by limiting the entry of light. Suppose if there is too much of light, sudden bright light comes, it constricts, so that the light should not damage the retina. Very sensitive part, and for that reason it protects. That means it limits the entry of the light into the retina. Second, light and dark adaptation is to maximize the visual activity depending upon the situation. If there is too much of a brightness, then we have to adapt to the brightness, then we try to start seeing. Okay, that is the function of the light reflex. Now I have made here the summarized the pathway: visual pathway, retina, optic nerve, optic chiasma, optic tract, pretectal nucleus both sides, Edinger-Westphal nucleus both sides, third cranial nerve, the constrictor pupillae, and action is constriction of the pupil. This is all about light reflex. Now, moving to the accommodation reflex. What is this accommodation reflex? It is the reflex to see the near or distant objectives. When we try to see the near objects, as the object approaches, there will be certain changes happening. Now what happens here? So the image, the object is coming nearer here, suddenly brought. See the how we test the accommodation reflex. We test the accommodation reflex. We ask the individual to focus at infinity and suddenly bring back to the tip of the nose where you place the finger. And when you place the finger, what happens? There will be a convergence of the eyeball. So now this is because when you are bringing in, suddenly the reflexly the eyeballs converge. So now what are the pathways for this thing? So first the retina as usual. These violet lines, you can just see that retina. From the retina, the pathway up to it will reach to lateral geniculate body and it will reach to the occipital cortex. This is the entire visual pathway. It goes to the visual pathway. From here, the parastriate, so that means visual cortex is area 17. 19 to 20, the parastriate cortex, by the side of this visual cortex, there it is relayed, and from here it will go to the occipito-mesenchymal tract. So this information go to the collicular nucleus or a tectal nucleus, pretectal nucleus. This is a tectal nucleus. And from this pretectal nucleus, so it is relayed onto two important locations. Right now, I am trying to focus on two important locations. One is to the Edinger-Westphal nucleus. Edinger-Westphal nucleus, as it is doing for the light reflex. That means this is bilateral. This is bilateral. And from the Edinger-Westphal nucleus, it goes to the ciliary ganglion. From the ciliary ganglion, it goes to the constrictor pupillae and also to the ciliary muscle. The constrictor pupillae is actively contracted. There is a constriction of the pupil, and then ciliary muscle contracts. So what happens? It relaxes, or the tension on the uh, lens is decreased, or whatever the ligament of the lens, suspensor ligament of the lens is diminished. Tension is decreased. Once the tension is decreased, it bulges out. So that means usually the lens is flattened, and when it releases, it becomes bulged. So convexity increases. So this is what this pathway is doing, going from the tectal nucleus into the Edinger-Westphal nucleus and then going into this thing. The main thing comes from the visual cortex. Now, what's happening here? What's happening here? There is a constriction of the pupil and then increased convexity of the lens. Then we have another thing. What's happening from here, from the tectal nucleus, because the tectal nucleus forms the reticular formation, and this tectal nucleus connects itself to the third cranial nerve. Because third cranial nerve has two components. So one component is a parasympathetic division that is there in the Edinger-Westphal nucleus, and then another is a motor division. It supplies the ocular muscles. And here it is the medial rectus, because convergence is the medial rectus, because now it will see that the medial rectus is contracted, it pulls down simultaneously, so that both sides it is converging. So that means here the from the tectal nucleus, it goes to the third cranial nerve nucleus. This is third cranial nerve nucleus, and from the third cranial nerve nucleus, it goes to the medial rectus, and this medial rectus contracts the medial rectus, and then brings about the convergence. At the same time, I have not shown here is the supply to the lateral rectus, because the lateral rectus is also playing role, because if it were to be diverging, so now it is the medial rectus and the lateral rectus, both of them together, because these are antagonistic muscles, they will be playing together, just like the extensor and the flexor muscles in the limb. Same thing happens here. Now, this is about accommodation reflex. Here I have mentioned retina, the pathway I have mentioned here. I have limited retina, optic nerve, optic chiasma, optic tract, lateral geniculate body, optic radiations, striate cortex, reaches the striate cortex here, area 17. Then from there, parastriate area 19 and 22. And then it will go to two places. One to the third cranial nerve nucleus, which is for parasympathetic division, that is the Edinger-Westphal nucleus, and the third cranial nucleus that is meant for the motor neurons. And from this one, from Edinger-Westphal nucleus, it goes to it is going to the ciliary ganglion, and from the ciliary ganglion, it will go to the constrictor pupil, brings about the constriction. And then again ciliary muscle that will bring the relax the suspensor ligament of the lens, and that increases the convexity. Then collicular nucleus means tectal nucleus. So that is given to the third cranial motor neuron pool, third cranial nerve motor neuron pool. From here, it is sent to the medial rectus. Here, what is happening? There are two paths there: collicular nucleus, one to the motor neuron pool, one the this is the direct pathway, another is an indirect pathway. So that means occipitofrontal and pronto-mesenchymal. Frontal or motor neurons, the bulbar, the corticobulbar fibers. These are corticobulbar fibers. They are activated. So that means you have this is a direct loop and this is an indirect loop. This indirect loop is trying to reinforce whatever the action is doing. Finally, the medial rectus nerve is activated, the medial rectus contracts, that would converge. Suppose if it is the opposite, it should be the lateral rectus. Because whenever we are talking about accommodation reflex, we are talking about a convergence. When we are talking about a divergence, so that should be lateral rectus. Otherwise, the same thing. Now, move on. I'm just trying to put the previous slide here. One I have made into four different compartments. Receptor, because whenever you are asked about this particular question, what are the receptors, what are the afferents, what is the center, and what are the efferents, and what are the effectors. Now, what are the receptors here? Receptors are rods and cones, that's the visual. Then what are the afferents? So the afferents are the visual pathway, entire visual pathway. That means optic nerve, lateral geniculate body, lateral geniculate body. This is lateral geniculate, the violet path, the lateral geniculate body, from the lateral geniculate body to the visual cortex. And what are the centers? This is visual cortex and tactile nucleus and Edinger-Westphal nucleus and the motor nerve nucleus. That means the mesenchymal or midbrain nuclei and the nuclei in the occipital cortex, nuclei in the frontal cortex. That means there are three set of nuclei which are trying to govern this. That is the center. So that is a corticotactile and the Edinger-Westphal nucleus. Efferents, what are the efferents? The efferents are in on parasympathetic division. That is the third cranial nerve that's going up here to the ciliary ganglion, and that brings about the supply the constrictor pupillae, constriction of the pupil, and supply the ciliary muscle and relaxes the or reduces the tension on the lens and makes it bulge. So that is what so now what it does, it is occipitotactile Edinger-Westphal nucleus and a ciliary nerve, and that brings about a constriction of the pupil and a convexity. These blue ones are the actions I have mentioned. Then part B is the third cranial motor component. This motor component, motor nerve supply the medial rectus, and in case of the near reflex, in case of the distant reflex, it may be lateral rectus. So now occipitocollicular third cranial nerve oculomotor nerve pool, oculomotor neuron pool. So that is what here it is. Here this part. So now what happens if this is one part, this is the occipitocollicular. So that means this is coming here, the mesenchymal, occipitocollicular or occipitomesenchymal. This path, this is the shortest path, and the longest path is occipitofrontal, and then from this the corticobulbar corticobulbar pathway. That means it involves the synapses there, and that would supply the motor nerve nucleus of the third cranial nerve, and that would bring about the convergence or divergence as required. So this is about the accommodation reflex. Now, what are the functions of the accommodation reflex? They focus the objects at near or distant according to the situation. so as to maximize the visual activity. I again summarized the pathway here. The pathway is visual pathway, retina to occipital cortex. Then the centers are occipital cortex to tactile area. Then this is oculomotor nerve is the efferent that is coming from the Edinger-Westphal nucleus or coming from the motor nerve of the oculomotor. So now what is the action? There are three C's there: convergence, constriction, convexity. Convergence of the eyeball, constriction of the pupil, and increased convexity of the eyeball. These are the actions of the accommodation reflex. Now, so what are the applied aspects? This is the last part of this. What are the applied aspects? One, let us see, for example, increased sympathetic activity produces a dilatation of the pupil. So when you get the increased sympathetic activity in anxiety, stress, excitement, exercise, and all those things, they dilate the pupil, and this condition is known as a mydriasis. Mydriasis. Increased parasympathetic activity that will contract the circular muscles. Both of them contract the muscles. Here it is the radial muscles that pulls, that makes the dilatation. Here it is the circular muscles that constrict, that would produce the meiosis, the increased parasympathetic active meiosis. So for that reason, to block this meiotic action, atropine drops, or what are if you are going to the uh, ophthalmology ward, they will use the drops having atropine or atropine agonists. So they will produce the opposite effect, because atropine blocks the acetylcholine action. Acetylcholine constricts and atropine dilates because it blocks that receptor, acetylcholine receptors. Now comes Argyll-Robertson pupil. Argyll-Robertson pupil is a condition especially associated with the tertiary syphilis. Nowadays it's not very greatly seen, and or with a neurosyphilis. And what happens in this condition? In this condition, you will find the small irregular pupils. The pupil size is smaller, that is meiotic, and irregular. It's not perfect. And in this condition, light reflex is absent. Light reflex, that means it involves those particular pathways. So if I am going back here, so there's somewhere this pathway is involved. So there's some of these neurons here, they may degenerate. So that means there is a absence of light reflex, but the accommodation reflex present, that persists. So this is a Argyll-Robertson pupil. Then there is another condition to bring into. There are many things. I have just only taken those two conditions which are physiologically important for us: Horner syndrome or oculosympathetic paresis. This results from the lesions in the sympathetic nerve, that means cervical rib pressing over the sympathetic ganglion there. So characterized by classic triad of meiosis, that is a constricted pupil because the sympathetic dilates, sympathetic is cut, there is a constriction. Because I mentioned there is a parasympathetic dominance, the meiosis, the constricted pupil, and what happens? It also supplies the eyelid muscle, and eyelid muscle. There is a drooping of the eyelid, the ptosis, meiosis, partial ptosis, and this is also supplying, because the sympathetic supply the facial nerve sweating glands, sweat glands, the skin of the fascia. Sweat glands are supplied by this the sympathetic nerve, and the loss of the sympathetic, there will be a decreased sweating, that is the anhydrosis. The meiosis, ptosis, anhydrosis, a classical triad. That is what the Horner syndrome is. That is bringing about the constrict. Any constricted people, you may think about these are the particular aspects. Also, In this Horner syndrome, there will be sinking of the eyeball, what is called enophthalmos. Enophthalmos, the sinking of the eyeball into the bony cavity, and this is to just to protect the eye from the injury or other effects. Okay, I'm just trying to cover up the all aspects about pupillary reflexes. There is a lot more, but I have restricted myself so that it will be useful for you to summarize. Thank you.